My name is Steve Twartz, and I'm going to tell you about my debut novel, The Veiled Thread, published by Pegasus Publishers in the UK. Charles Perkins, the great Aboriginal Australian activist, once said, "We know we cannot live in the past, but the past lives in us." That is the underlying theme of The Veiled Thread and its sequel, The Severed Cord, yet to be published. I'll explain as we get into this presentation, but first, something of my background and the story I'm telling. I'm the son of a World War II veteran airman and a nurse from country New South Wales, an unremarkable ancestry, except that in Australian terms, my forebears were white Australian originals. 1788 First Fleeters on mum's side, 1840s refugees from Germany on dad's. So I bear the scars and benefits of both of those diasporas. I grew up in the affluent post-war years, the baby boom 50s and the liberating 60s and 70s. I roamed the countryside in both city and country towns. The surfing took hold of me. It still keeps me firmly in its grip. Not content with a conventional career, I opted for geology, a pursuit that became a passion, brought me close to the genesis of all things, the creation of this planet. As a result, I believe in the power of the planet to shape our destinies. Geology has taken me to so many wonderful places across the globe. One of the greatest privileges for me has been living and working in Bangladesh. It's one of the poorest nations on earth. It's crowded, grindingly poor, but the people have a vibrance, a positivity that is the envy of many richer, more fortunate countries. The impetus to write, to tell stories, comes from my association with Bangladeshis and my observation of how we have interacted, have dealt with Australia's first people, and recognition that the past lives in us all, that the past somehow influences my present, my behaviours, my responses, my fears, and my acceptance of self. The story I tell, The Veiled Thread, has as its underlying theme the concept of inherited trauma. I'll elaborate on that soon. There's a war, World War I in Palestine, against principally the Turks. It revolves about the lives of two men, a grandfather and a grandson. It follows the degradation of one as he copes with war, then the Great Depression, and the abandonment of all his hopes. Interwoven with this is a modern story featuring his grandson, a man plagued by doubts, by infidelity and denial, things he cannot comprehend, sources he cannot recognise in his own upbringing. Don't let these themes deter you. There's plenty of action and drama and adventure to keep the pages turning. The concept of inherited trauma is not new. It's been steadily gaining support for many years. Now, though, we have a chemical or genetic basis for believing that it actually happens. Trauma does leave a chemical signature on the genes, a signature that is most definitely inherited. There's no change to the base DNA. It's not a mutation, but rather it's a mechanism available to us all, a mechanism that switches genes on and off. These are called epigenetic changes, changes that follow cell division, that are passed through the generations from conception to conception. The phenomenon we have here has a name, epigenetics. Epi from the Greek meaning on top of, so on top of the DNA, not within it. And trauma can be described as a reaction brought on by a significant event, creating a deep, lasting, abiding effect. There have been a number of clinical studies into epigenetics. Here are a few. Other interesting studies involve Native American experience with European invasion and the survivors of the 9/11 disaster. Whilst there are critics of these studies, the links are there. World War I in Palestine. The contribution of the Australian Light Horse to the campaign that eventually overcame the Turks. A campaign involving Australia from its inception at the ill-fated Gallipoli to the taking of Jerusalem and Damascus. The grandfather, who leaves for the war as a positive young man, but returns something different. The grandson, who, despite little connection with his grandfather through his life, discovers clues in the old man, clues about his own self-doubt. They meet when the old man is nearing the end of his life. The meeting unleashes forces and conflicts that are totally unanticipated. Despite this, they bond and provide an avenue for recovery for both of them. The book explores, though doesn't dwell on the horrors of war. It looks at the dislocation and ruin brought on by the Great Depression and touches on the tragedy of the Second War and explains and examines the ruin of all hopes. The grandson grapples with dysfunction in his life, dissatisfaction, unease with relationships, and eventually, as the story progresses, finds that his feelings may have deep roots in his family's history. It's a novel with many layers, and I believe it is a suitable allegory for our society, for the manner in which we treat our first people and how we deal with inherent dysfunction. Thank you for taking time to listen to my story. We live by virtue of our ancestors and can never fully divorce ourselves from the history of our forebears. In the words of Robert Louis Stevenson, sooner or later, we all sit down to a banquet of consequences. Enjoy the book.